All right, we are going to move on to lesson 6 of unit 7. A normal curve with a mean of 500 and a standard deviation of 100 is shown. Remember, in the last lesson, we talked about what a normal distribution or normal curve is. Shade the region under the curve within one standard deviation of the mean. So, notice if we go back to our notes from our last lesson, okay, our mean is going to be in the middle, okay, and it's symmetric about it, okay. So our mean is at 500. So one standard deviation above the mean. So one standard deviation above the mean is going to be 500 plus one standard deviation. So 500 plus 100. Okay. So that's one standard deviation above average or above the mean. One standard deviation below the mean is, and now I'm going to take the mean and I'm going to subtract the standard deviation. So this is going to be, in this case, 400 is going to be one standard deviation below the mean. So it says to shade the region under the curve within one standard deviation of the mean. So that means anything between 400 and 600. And again, please pardon my horrible artistic abilities, but everything that I'm shading here, okay, that anything in that range is going to be within one standard deviation of the mean. How much of the data falls within that one, within the shaded region? Well, let's go back to our lesson notes from the last lesson. We know that 68% of the data is within one standard deviation of the mean. So in this particular case, since I shaded one standard deviation, how much of the data falls within the shaded region? About 68%. Okay, so that's just a rehash of the notes from the previous lesson. Okay. One more example. So the stopping distance of a certain car traveling at 60 miles per hour follows an approximately normal distribution with a mean of 130 and a standard deviation of 5 feet. Okay, so the stopping distance of a certain car traveling at 60 miles per hour follows an approximal normal distribution with a mean of 130 feet and a standard deviation of 5 feet. Approximately what percent of the time does the car stop at a distance of between 120 and 140 feet? Okay, so if I were to do the same thing that I did in the previous example, so let me draw a bell curve again. Okay. So the one in the middle would be the mean. In this case, the mean would be 130. And if I were to go, say, one standard deviation above, that would be 130 plus the standard deviation of 5, so 135. Two standard deviations above would be 140, and three standard deviations above would be 145. And then if I were to go below the mean, well, one standard deviation below the average would be 130 minus the standard deviation, so that would give me 125. Two standard deviations below would be 120. Three standard deviations below would be 115. In other words, subtract the standard deviation 3 times. And what they're asking here is they're asking between 120 and 140. So that's this range right here between 120 and 140. So 120, remember, that is 2 standard deviations below average. So 2 standard deviations below the mean. And 140 feet is 2 standard deviations above the mean. So that means anything in that range is within 2 standard deviations of the mean. So really what they're asking is, what percent is within 2 standard deviations of the mean? And if I go back to my lesson notes from the last lesson, that would be 95%. So in this case, that would be approximately what percent of the time does the car stop at a distance between 120 and 140 feet? The answer would be approximately 95%. And that is it for this lesson.